The sound you're hearing right now is iconic. The twin blades making that sound are mounted on one of the most influential aircraft to ever take to the sky. The first proper utility helicopter that remains in service nearly 70 years later, the UH-1, or as you probably know it, the Huey. Today, in a special video, we will explore the design and development of the UH-1, how it evolved into the world's first dedicated attack helicopter, and the reason both of these aircraft have managed to stay in service so long. For those of you who have been around my channel for a while, this video is a combination of 3 of my older videos, re-recorded with a better microphone, with new footage, new photos, and entirely new sections thrown in. I hope you enjoy. In every war since the beginning of time, military commanders have had to wrestle with 2 issues: how to get troops and materiel into the fight, and how to get wounded soldiers out of it. The first battlefield ambulances had appeared as early as the 18th century, with the French flying ambulances that used the same carriages as the horse-drawn flying artillery or artillerie volante. This method, with the addition of a piston engine around a century later, would remain the status quo, until Korea, where the flying ambulance became a reality. The Korean War would see the first widespread battlefield use of helicopters, with vehicles like the Sikorsky H-5 and H-19, the Hiller OH-23 and the iconic Bell H-13, providing new solutions to medical evacuations, pilot rescues and resupply missions. These early helicopters were tiny, slow, noisy and unreliable, but they proved that the helicopter had a place on the modern battlefield. But at this point, nobody had any idea how important this new vehicle was going to become. In 1954, the US Army would launch a design competition for a new utility and medevac helicopter. The specification called for a vehicle that could move a payload of 360 kilograms for a distance of at least 365 kilometers, cruising at a speed of 184 kilometers per hour, at a service ceiling of 1800 meters. Many thought this completely impossible, and it certainly looked that way, but the pioneers over at Bell Helicopters thought otherwise. They had gained the Army's trust thanks to the hugely successful Bell 47, an already well-known vehicle and one that had saved many lives in Korea. But its tiny 200 horsepower piston engine was extremely limiting. Larger designs like the Sikorsky H-19 were more capable, but the heavy radial engine mounted awkwardly in the nose of the H-19 limited its mobility, and it was clear a new approach would be needed. Bell found no real advantage in using piston engines, and for the new design, they wanted to use a gas turbine. It was the jet age after all. Luckily for them, the Army had been funding their own turbine power plant, the 700 horsepower Lycoming XT-53, the brainchild of German engineer Dr. Anselm Franz, the man who had been behind the Jumo 004 engines that powered many of Germany's fledgling jet aircraft. Bell and Lycoming would work together to adapt this engine for helicopter use, using the basic structure of the Bell 47 in a larger, fully enclosed design, with a lightweight engine and gearbox mounted just below the rotor. This design would end up winning the Army contract, with 3 prototypes of the vehicle ordered in June 1955. Bell called it the Model 204, while the Army knew it as the XH-40. The new aircraft was a simple, tidy design. Unlike Sikorsky's H-19, the pilots and passengers were all on the same level, and the helicopter was easy to get in and out of thanks to the low floor and large cabin doors. Testing in October 1956 found no major problems with the design, and after a 6-vehicle service batch was completed, 9 pre-production aircraft were ordered. Originally, the Bell 204 was going to be the H-40, but the Army revised the designation system. A new helicopter was known instead as the HU-1 Iroquois. In reality, very few called the HU-1 the Iroquois. The HU, standing for Helicopter Utility, gave rise to a far superior and completely unofficial nickname, the Huey. The first Hueys were delivered to the Army in June 1959, with Bell Helicopter and the US Army still unaware they had just created one of the most important vehicles in history. The HU-1A was not the Huey we all know and love, however, and work was already underway on the first of many variants. The Army was concerned that the A model wouldn't have the power to handle the hot and high conditions it needed, and a more powerful engine was requested. The HU-1B, first flying in early 1960, would use either the 960 horsepower T-53L5 or the 1100 horsepower T-53L11, and would have a stretched fuselage, able to carry either 7 troops or 3 stretchers, 2 sitting casualties and a medic, or nearly 1.4 tons of cargo. With the introduction of the HU-1B, some in the Army were beginning to understand the potential that the vehicle had, namely a General Hamilton Howze, the Director of Army Aviation. He was incredibly excited about the idea of moving vast amounts of infantry around the battlefield using these new helicopters, and in 1961 headed the Tactical Mobility Requirements Board, which was formed to test new theories of warfare. The Army created the 11th Air Assault Division specifically to test Howze's theories, and trials began of this new Helicopter Mobile Infantry Division. The 11th did have some glaring disadvantages. Its mobility on the ground was poor, it was vulnerable to armoured assaults, and operations could be easily hampered by bad weather. However, the advantages couldn't be ignored. Blisteringly fast tempo and reaction times, long-range capability, high flexibility, and the ability to concentrate forces at key points to rapidly achieve their objectives. These trials showed that the 11th Air Assault Division could easily find their opposition and then quickly bring in all the firepower and supplies necessary to destroy him before the enemy could react. The Huey helicopter and these successful tests would fundamentally change how the Army was planning to deploy and resupply its infantry from this point on. And on the 1st of July 1965, the 11th Air Assault Division, along with elements of the 10th Air Transport Brigade and the 2nd Infantry, would combine to form the 1st Cavalry Division, Air Mobile. Less than a month later, 1st Cav would be sent overseas to join the fighting in the dense jungles of Vietnam. But this was not the Huey's first experience of combat, nor of Vietnam. 3 years earlier, in March 1962, the first Hueys, now using the designation UH-1A, were deployed to the country as part of the 57th Medical Detachment, flying medevac missions for the South Vietnamese long before the US had begun any sort of official involvement. Over the next few years, as the American presence increased, UH-1Bs were deployed as transport aircraft and soon would be ferrying US Army troops into combat, with many airframes being modified to carry rockets, machine guns, and grenade launchers. The Army had already begun to develop tactics for the dense jungle landing zones in-country. As the troop-laden transport helicopters approached the LZ, special gunship aircraft would swoop down, spraying the tree line with rockets and machine gun fire. Transports would then touch down, unloading their troops into the tall grass and taking off again within seconds, while their onboard door gunners would spray their M60 machine guns for cover. Suddenly, thanks to the Huey, Army commanders could deploy entire battalions deep within enemy territory in just a few minutes. By 1965, when the first cavalry arrived on the scene, there were almost 200,000 American troops stationed in Vietnam, and the division, along with its 400 UH-1 helicopters, would soon begin to encounter and engage large numbers of Viet Cong as well as North Vietnamese Army regulars. Many predicted that the Americans, many of whom were drafted over the course of the war, would perform incredibly poorly against the North Vietnamese, a nation who had been fighting for decades, first the Japanese, then the French, then the South Vietnamese, and now the US. However, Hanoi didn't have the Huey helicopter, and they had not, unlike the Americans, spent the last 10 years devising a new type of helicopter mobile warfare. Despite their elaborate intelligence networks, the NVA could never predict the Americans' movements, or when the next troop-laden Hueys would swoop down to deploy hundreds of well-equipped Army infantrymen. The arrival of the UH-1C in September 1965 only made things even easier for the Army. The C-model Hueys were more powerful and more manoeuvrable, and had been designed specifically to be used as gunships, bristling with 2.75-inch rockets, 40mm grenade launchers, 7.62mm M60 light machine guns, or M21 miniguns. The B model, now the standard in Vietnam, would be used for troop transport, while the C model would support in the gunship role. The first big test for the Air Cav would come in the Battle of the Yadrang Valley in late 1965, where American troops were deployed into the valley at 2 landing zones, LZ's X-Ray and Albany, and would be forced to defend these drop zones after coming under attack from a huge number of North Vietnamese troops. Using helicopter, fixed-wing and artillery support, the Americans were able to hold the landing zones and drive away the oncoming North Vietnamese, but both sides took a large number of casualties and both claimed victory. The battles of Yadrang proved to be a blueprint for both sides' tactics moving forward. The Americans would use their extreme mobility and overwhelming firepower to attempt to seize their objectives in seek and destroy missions. The Vietnamese, meanwhile, would counter this by attacking the Americans before they could deploy this firepower. PAVN Colonel Nguyen Hue An said to his troops attacking LZ Albany, "Move inside the column, grab them by the belt, and thus avoid casualties from the artillery and air. The Americans would logically be a lot less confident calling in airstrikes on their own positions after all. Yadrang would also see the first large-scale deployment of a new Huey helicopter, the UH-1D. The D model was significantly larger, capable of carrying 12 troops, or up to 6 stretcher cases, soon becoming the Army's primary combat transport and medevac aircraft in Vietnam, while the UH-1B and C vehicles would be used as the gunships. The longer UH-1D and later UH-1H Hueys can be identified from the fact that they have 2 windows in their stretched side doors, rather than a single larger window of the A, B and C models. Colloquially, the troop transports would be known as slicks, due to the lack of weapons on the sides of the helicopters. The armed Hueys would be the gunships, and the medevac choppers would be known as dust-offs, in honour of the radio call sign of Major Charles Kelly, commander of the original US Army Medical Evacuation Unit in Vietnam. Dust-off Hueys would accomplish just under 30,000 medical evacuations in 1969 alone, saving countless lives. In World War II, 29% of all wounded US soldiers died. In Korea, this fell to 26%. The widespread use of medevac helicopters in Vietnam would see this plummet to only 19%. In total, 900,000 people were evacuated by helicopter ambulances in Vietnam, with pilots flying dangerous missions into hot LZs, willing to drop directly into a firefight in an attempt to save lives. The Huey would also prove to be instrumental in dealing with the massive Tet Offensive of 1968, allowing the US to quickly evaluate, support and redeploy its forces to inflict massive casualties on the Vietnamese. Tet also saw the introduction of the first dedicated attack helicopter, the AH-1G HueyCobra, which is based very closely off the Huey while being faster, more manoeuvrable and carrying more firepower, but more on that later. The Huey itself was relatively resilient, being able to take a significant amount of hits from small arms fire and still remain airborne. That being said, the crew inside were vulnerable, with the thin aluminium plating providing little to no protection. The pilots at least had some armour plate beneath them, but anyone in the back was on their own. That's the logic behind them sitting on their helmets in Apocalypse Now, by the way. By the 1970s, the US had started to withdraw from Vietnam, which is good timing for Huey pilots as the NVA had started to introduce Soviet-made man-portable surface-to-air missile systems like the SA-7 Strela, a weapon that would have been incredibly dangerous to the low-flying helicopters. The South Vietnamese pilots had to immediately devise new tactics to avoid these weapons, something the Americans never really had to deal with. When Saigon fell in 1975, Huey helicopters were still the main vehicle for evacuation, flying out to American ships waiting offshore and unloading their cargo before flying right back. Many Huey helicopters belonging to the South Vietnamese Air Force would land and then be pushed immediately overboard to make room for another landing. The Huey had shaped the Vietnam War, and had proved such a huge influence on how that war was fought by both sides. The Vietnam War likewise had shaped the Huey, with the nimble UH-1C, the stretched UH-1D and H, and the sleek AH-1G all arising directly from the conflict. The end of the Vietnam War was in no way the end of the Huey helicopter though. The UH-1H, I've mentioned a couple of times, was introduced around 1968 and was outwardly identical to the UH-1D, but mounted a more powerful engine. By the time the last UH-1H was delivered in 1976, over 5,400 had been produced, making it by far the most numerous variant of the Huey, compared to 2,000 UH-1Ds, 750 UH-1Cs, 1,000 UH-1Bs, and less than 200 UH-1As. The Marines had their own Huey, the UH-1E, which had been modified for carrier operations by adding a rescue hoist, a rotor brake, and using anti-corrosive materials. The UH-1F was used by the US Air Force for missile site support duties, as well as the very mysterious UH-1P, which flew classified psychological warfare missions in Vietnam. The Navy would have the HH-1K and UH-1L, both based on the seafaring UH-1E, and used for search and rescue duties as well as training. The UH-1N would be the next major upgrade for the series, with twin gas turbine engines. As early as 1965, Bell had been working on a Model 208, fitting a UH-1D airframe with two T-72 turboshafts on a common gearbox, each rated to over 900 horsepower. Combined, this would have been too much for the rotor to handle, so each jet was derated down to 765 horsepower. However, if one of these engines failed, the other could be brought back up to 900 horsepower, providing more than enough power to keep the helicopter airborne. These dual-engine Hueys were faster, more capable, and significantly safer, and the UH-1N became the new standard. Production vehicles used Canadian PT-6T turboshafts and would be deployed as early as 1970 with the Air Force, seeing some limited action in Vietnam. The twin Huey would see combat in Iraq and Afghanistan, but by this point the airframes were showing their age and replacements were being looked at. But the Marines decided instead to upgrade the Huey one last time, to this. But before we can talk about the UH-1Y Venom, we first need to better understand the AH-1Z Viper, which means we have to first take a deep dive into the AH-1G HueyCobra. About 60 years ago, the first prototype of the AH-1 took off on its maiden flight, the first helicopter ever to be designed specifically for combat. The Cobra set the standard for attack helicopters, just as the Huey had set the standard for utility helicopters, and it's important to understand how Bell engineers managed to take the humble UH-1 design and turn it into the greatest attack helicopter to ever fly. By the mid-1960s, America was hopelessly entangled in the Vietnam War and was deploying UH-1 helicopters as gunships, strapping M60s, 40mm grenade launchers, and 2.7-inch rocket pods to the Huey and using them to suppress the enemy as troop transport aircraft dropped off their valuable cargo. And this worked. But even the newest UH-1C was struggling to keep up with the unarmed UH-1Ds carrying the troops. Armed Hueys could only reach 90 miles per hour, whereas the Slicks could get up to 104 miles an hour. This issue was even worse when the gunships were deployed alongside CH-47 Chinooks, which could fly up to 50 miles per hour faster than their escorts. The troop transports had to either slow down significantly or make the decision to abandon the gunships, both of which resulted in higher loss rates. But a solution was already on the drawing board, the Advanced Aerial Fire Support System, or AAFSS, which began in August of 1964. Initially, the plan was for an interim solution based on existing designs, which was to be capable of reaching at least 140 knots while carrying a payload of around 1,500 pounds. This idea was rejected in favour of a completely new design, with Army top brass arguing that there was no point in tying themselves to an inferior weapons system. They wanted a new, state-of-the-art helicopter, and so AAFSS was born. The program would be narrowed to two designs by 1965, the Sikorsky S-66 and the Lockheed CL-840. The Lockheed design, officially designated the AH-56A Cheyenne, would end up winning the competition and would first fly in 1967. But the Cheyenne, as you can tell, was an extremely complex design, and while hugely impressive, was plagued with cost increases, accidents, and technical delays. These issues eventually led to the program's cancellation in 1972. But far before this, it had become clear that the Cheyenne was not going to be ready soon enough to keep up with the Army's needs in Southeast Asia, and in 1965, while the AAFSS program was still in progress, the Army admitted that an interim solution would indeed be required, and so the search commenced. They returned with 5 designs: the Kaman UH-2, the Sikorsky S-61, the Piasecki 16H, a gunship variant of the Chinook, and the Bell Model 209. All of these were based on existing helicopters, but unlike the other competitors, Bell had been working on their design for the best part of 7 years. As early as 1958, Bell Helicopter had been working on a combat helicopter, first adapting the Model 204 to serve as a combat recon aircraft known as the D-245. They received little to no support for this project, however, as this was before America had entered Vietnam and realised the need for such a design. The company continued to plug away at the D-245 project at its own expense, presenting the D-255 Iroquois Warrior in June 1962. As the name suggested, the D-255 used components of the UH-1 Iroquois and had a number of innovative features that would later appear on the Cobra, such as the extended aerodynamic fuselage, tandem cockpit and stub wings, as well as the forward machine gun turret. The D-255 was probably the world's first true combat helicopter, and later versions would see the stepped tandem cockpit replaced with a one-piece design. But D-255 was only a mock-up and would never fly. It was impressive enough to warrant more work, and Bell would expense a low-cost testbed for the attack helicopter concept, testing as many aspects of the D-245 and D-255 as possible, just on a smaller scale. The result was this, the Model 207. This aircraft, based on the Model 47, was also then known as the OH-13X Sioux Scout. It kept the landing skids, central fuselage, tail boom and tail rotor of the Model 47, while using the rotor and power plant of the military OH-13S. Unlike the Model 47 or the OH-13S, the Sioux Scout had the tandem cockpit, aerodynamic fuselage, stubby wings and chin turret of the D-255, and was the first of Bell's combat helicopter designs to actually fly, on the 27th of June, 1963. For the next 16 months, the aircraft would be tested extensively, logging a total of 304 hours in the air and being flown by 340 pilots. It was a huge success. Testing done on the Model 207 by the 11th Air Assault Division concluded that a similar helicopter should be developed, but with a larger payload and a turboshaft powerplant. But this was going to be expensive, and at that time there was still no requirement. However, Bell was receiving detailed reports from its technical representatives about the escalating war in Vietnam, and they became convinced that the US military would soon realise the need for a combat helicopter, and they wanted to be prepared. On the 16th of December 1964, work began on the interim combat helicopter. Naturally, it was to be based off the UH-1, in order to reduce costs and development time. Bell also embraced the idea of offering the new aircraft as a variant of the Huey, easing their purchase and introduction into Army service. Construction began in March 1965, shooting for an October 1st maiden flight so they could demonstrate the new helicopter to the Bush board on November the 1st at the very latest. Not an awful lot of time. Work was done in secrecy, with a new work area being constructed known as the Green Room in a faraway hangar and only a select few given access. The room would also be referred to as the Steam Room by those who worked inside it, as it got almost unbearably hot during the summer months. Anyway, on the 3rd of September 1965, the Model 209 was rolled out of the factory and revealed to the public, bearing the civil registration N209J. N209J first took to the skies 4 days later, reaching a top speed of 104 miles per hour a day after that, 184 miles per hour a few days after that, before breaking 200 miles per hour on the 25th. Safe to say this machine would have no problem keeping up. The Model 209 was largely an amalgamation of all the projects Bell had worked on before: the UH-1, the D-245, the D-255 and the Model 207. It was unbelievably sleek and aerodynamic, with recessed rivets, flush-mounted antenna, fiberglass fairings around the swash plate, and even retractable landing skids. Despite looking nothing like the UH-1, especially from the front, the Model 209 used the tail rotor, transmission and propulsion system of the C model Huey, the Lycoming T-53L11. In fact, Bell claimed that 85% of the mechanical components used were identical to those used on the UH-1C, making it much more attractive from a spare parts and maintenance point of view. The narrow fuselage had a two-man tandem cockpit, with the pilot in the rear and the gunner in the front, operating his M134 machine gun turret, which was paired with a computer that helped compensate for target deviations and calculated lead angles. The 8,000 rounds of ammunition for the 7.62mm Gatling gun was stored in these boxes under the cockpit, which folded out quite nicely for access. You can see in this photo the ammo storage, as well as the flaps for the retractable landing skids and the Chevrolet brand cockpit strut they sourced from a Chevy dealer in Fort Worth. The pilot could fire the turret as well, but only in the locked forward position. His main armament was mounted on the stubby wings either side of the aircraft, mounting rocket or machine gun pods. These wings also provided lift, relieving stress on the rotor and allowing for a much more manoeuvrable aircraft. Experience in Vietnam had shown that helicopters get shot an awful lot, often by 7.62mm rounds. To address this, Bell spent considerable effort armouring areas of the aircraft in order to protect the pilots and other key areas. The bucket seats were made of 1/4-inch steel, the gunner had a nose plate and a 1.125-inch armoured windscreen, the hydraulic system, engine compressor and fuel control system all had armour plates, and the fuel tanks were armoured as well as self-sealing. And, as it was the 1960s, the crew even got their own ashtrays. In November 1965, N209J was shipped to Edwards AFB for testing against the other interim helicopter designs, and by March 1966, it was abundantly clear that the Model 209 was the superior aircraft. However, it took until April 1967 for Bell to get the $23 million contract for 112 aircraft, including 2 pre-production models. N209J would fly on, serving as a test bed for modifications and weapons loadouts until 1971, and going on a tour to showcase the exciting new design to the world. Bizarrely, during these demonstrations, the gunner's control stick mounted a taxidermied head of a king cobra as a marketing gag, with the head inexplicably getting lost during a display in Munich in 1967. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. When the aircraft won the contract, it was still only known as the Model 209. It was even meant to be adopted as the UH-1H, to further hit home how it was simply another variant of the Huey, but in May 1966 it was changed to the AH-1G, Attack Helicopter 1. The pre-production models were given the designation YAH-1G, and the first took off on October 15, 1966, undergoing rigorous testing at Fort Hood. In May 1967, the first production aircraft began to leave the Bell factory, boasting a number of modifications compared to N209J. The most obvious is the lack of retractable landing skids. After a lot of testing, it was discovered that the complex, expensive, but very handsome retractable skids only gave a speed increase of around 3 miles per hour, and the engineers knew that in combat conditions, fixed skids were a much more reliable option, so they were removed. The production AH-1Gs also mounted a larger diameter XM64 machine gun turret. This turret still only had one M134 Gatling, but the later installation of the M28 turret of the same diameter allowed the installation of 2 miniguns, 2 40mm grenade launchers, or a combination of the two, effectively doubling the gunner's firepower. The wingspan was increased slightly, and the wings themselves were reinforced. The seats were replaced with spaced armour versions, and the more powerful L13 power plant was fitted, boasting 300 extra horsepower. The last significant change was the removal of the bulletproof windshield after calculations revealed that the hit chance was less than 4%, but try telling that to the poor gunner. After these two contracts were fulfilled, the military quickly placed another, and by March 1967, contracts were in place for 530 aircraft. Safe to say that the AH-1G was here to stay, and it was only getting started. AH-1G is a long name though, don't you think? Helicopters in the US Army usually got named after Native American tribes, the Sioux, the Chickasaw, the Chinook, etc. But this convention wasn't used for the AH-1. The Army was in a legal dispute with Piper, who used the same names for their own aircraft, and even though the UH-1 was technically the Iroquois, nobody in the US used the name anyway. And so, adapting a nickname already in use for machine gun wielding gunships, they called the new aircraft the AH-1G HueyCobra. But the Cobra was only just getting started. Between the years of 1967 and 1973, Bell built some 1,116 AH-1Gs for the US Army, and the Cobra amassed over 1 million operational hours over Vietnam. Around 300 Cobras would be destroyed during the war. 157 were shot down by ground fire, 4 by surface-to-air missiles, 12 were destroyed on the ground, and 109 were lost to accidents. Being a snake driver was no cakewalk. Typically, the Cobras would be deployed with the slicks as we talked about earlier, but often the Cobra would form hunter-killer teams, pairing with OH-6A Cayuse scout helicopters that would fly low to locate a target before the AH-1G came in to destroy it. The AH-1G, as much as I love it, was not perfect however. The minigun lacked penetrative power in the dense jungle, and the 2.75-inch FFAR was pretty inaccurate and inadequate for dealing with enemy armour. Some Cobras were fitted with 20mm rotary cannons on their left wing to compensate for this, with the blast so powerful the portside cockpit needed up-armoured. Starting in April 1969, the US Marine Corps also began to use AH-1G Cobras, but the G wasn't the right Cobra for the job. The US Marine Corps had, along with the Army, realised that attack helicopters were going to be a vital part of their doctrine moving forward, but had not been given the funding to buy their own. But the Tet Offensive changed things. Firstly, it showed that the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese had been significantly underestimated. And secondly, it had proven to be a golden opportunity for the Cobra pilots to show off the capabilities of their new machines. Soon, Congress agreed that the Marines should have gunships as well, but with a twist. The Marine pilots would spend a lot, if not most, of their time over water. This meant that they wanted redundancy in their helicopter, 2 engines. And so, the AH-1J SeaCobra was born. By mounting 2 power plants side by side, the SeaCobras would be significantly safer. Each engine would be limited during normal flight, but if one were to fail, the other could be powered back up to ensure the aircraft could return safely. There were other changes too. A larger tail fin, a larger tail rotor, and an enhanced climate control system allowed the SeaCobras to fly in significantly worse weather, and an explosive cord snaking around the cockpit canopy allowed it to be ejected in the case of a water landing. The airframe was reinforced to account for the increased weight, and corrosion protection was added. But the most fun change was this. The AH-1J has a 3-barreled 20mm cannon up front for increased punch. The SeaCobra first flew in November 1969. With the first batch of 49 aircraft, being delivered to the USMC by the end of 1972. Another 20 were ordered, with the final airframe entering service in early 1975. AH-1J SeaCobras would serve the Marines well into the 1990s, seeing action in Desert Storm. But as this was happening, the Army was looking for a replacement for the AH-1G, which had, after all, only ever been a stopgap design. However, by 1971, it was clear that the Cheyenne was not going to be the answer, and Sikorsky and Bell both submitted rival designs. Sikorsky put forward the S-67 Black Hawk, which was based on the S-61 Sea King in the same way the Cobra had been based on the UH-1 Iroquois. But Bell's design wasn't a Cobra, it was a King Cobra. Right, so this Bell King Cobra was essentially a further development on the AH-1, keeping the same proven airframe but improving on it, hence the King Cobra moniker. And there would be two King Cobras, a single engine version for the Army based on the AH-1G and a twin engine version for the Marines based on the AH-1J. The King Cobra was said to be better and bigger than the Cobra. The tail boom was extended, the tail fin was taller, a ventral tail fin was added, and a new rotor was fitted, with wider, longer blades paired with a larger tail rotor. The new rotor designs were quieter and provided far more lift. It was set to be around 40% heavier than the AH-1, so larger engines were fitted, a 2,000 horsepower T55L7C for the Army, and the 1,800 horsepower T400 CP400 for the Marines. Bell was already planning to upgrade the transmission to allow up to 2,400 shaft horsepower to be supplied to the rotors in the future, and then the technology. The King Cobra's new nose had this distinctive sensor turret above the gun, housing the SMS, Stabilized Multi-Sensor Sight. This contained thermal and low-light cameras, a laser rangefinder and a targeting system for TOW anti-tank missiles, all of which could be beamed directly to the gunner's sight or the pilot's heads-up display. The pilot also had his own low-light camera, allowing night flying. In addition, the King Cobra had this ridiculous list of avionic upgrades, the 20mm rotary cannon of the AH-1J, and 4 underwing hardpoints for rockets, gun pods, or up to 16 TOW missiles. The twin-engine prototype, N309J, first flew in September 1971, with the Army version arriving on the scene in January 1972. Just as the King Cobra was to be submitted for Army trials, this single-engined aircraft was badly damaged in a crash, and the twin-engined airframe was modified with a single engine and then sent for evaluation instead, performing just as Bell had hoped, excellently. So, in August 1972, the Army announced the results of the competition. It was not going to procure the AH-56, nor was it going to procure the S-67. But it also decided not to procure the King Cobra. Instead, they decided to completely re-evaluate their attack helicopter strategy and start it afresh. This program would eventually result in the Army's adoption of the AH-64 Apache. Boo. But while the Army was going to be doing all this starting again malarkey, they were still going to be flying the AH-1G, which was becoming more and more dated. That's how the passage of time works, after all. Anyway, a key weakness of the Cobra was a lack of anti-tank performance, which was showcased towards the end of the Vietnam War when Cobra pilots were attempting to destroy T-54s with 2.75-inch FFARs. It could apparently take 50-plus rockets to knock out one tank. Bell had identified the TOW missile as the solution, which was probably the reason they mounted 16 of them onto the King Cobra prototype, which the Army had seen as a massive success despite not procuring them. So, parts of the TOW system from the King Cobra were grafted onto AH-1G airframes, designated YAH-1Qs. Each was planned to carry up to 8 TOW missiles. Well, it turns out that the TOW was heavier and more powerful than first thought, and compared to the King Cobra, the lighter, less powerful YAH-1Q was not rugged enough to cope. Test firings were causing rivets to pop out and structural damage to appear in the tail assembly. $60 million later, these issues were solved, but at the cost of a heavier airframe, meaning a large hit to maneuverability. But time was ticking, the Soviets were looming, and the AH-1 pilots still did not have their missiles, so Bell were given the go-ahead to build the first tranche of AH-1Qs despite them being underpowered, with deliveries beginning in June 1975. An upgraded aircraft with a new, more powerful engine would appear around a year later.
The AH-1S. Coupled with an already existing tow missile capability, it means that your aircraft can now bring an even greater variety of more potent firepower against a wider variety of targets.
Stationed in Europe during the height of the Cold War, the success of the defence of Europe was resting largely on these tow-toting AH-1Qs. If even half of the 950 Cobras stationed in Europe had survived long enough to fire just 4 of their 8 tow missiles, and assuming 80% of missiles fired hit their targets, some 1,500 enemy vehicles would have been put out of action. That's 5 Soviet armoured divisions completely wiped out before they even reached the army. NATO estimates were even more generous, assuming that an AH-1G would be able to fire on average 12 to 19 tow missiles before being lost. That's between 11,000 and 18,000 armoured vehicles destroyed, up to 36 armoured divisions. It was ambitious, to say the least. The army would operate 3 other variants of the Cobra, the AH-1P, E, and F. Each had their own set of upgrades that were implemented over the later half of the 1970s, with the goal being to give the army a highly capable attack helicopter until the AH-64s could fill the gap. In somewhat of a last gasp, Bell submitted a quote-unquote new design to the army, the Improved Attack Cobra, or Cobra 2. This airframe had started life as an AH-1G, converted to an AH-1Q, then served as the YAH-1S before becoming the Model 249 Cobra 2, and was essentially an AH-1F with engine upgrades, full all-weather capability, and the ability to fire Hellfire, fire-and-forget anti-tank missiles, with the idea being to serve well into the early 2000s. The Army rejected it, as it was dead set on the LHX program, which would emerge as the very ill-fated RAH-66 Comanche. Luckily for us, this isn't the end of the story, as the Marine Corps really likes the Cobra platform, and Bell built on the success of the AH-1J SeaCobra. Funny thing is, the majority of the AH-1Js weren't built for the USMC, they were built for Iran. Yes, 202 AH-1J SeaCobras were sold to the Iranians in December 1972, but with modifications. A better engine, oil cooler, recoil dampening for the gun, a stabilised sight and gunner's seat were enough that it received a new designation, the AH-1J International. And of course, these are still in service today, with heavy modifications. The upgrades for the AH-1J International were paid for by the Iranians, and then almost immediately pounced upon by the US Marine Corps. In spring 1974, Bell received a contract from the Marines for an improved AH-1T, incorporating some features from the King Cobra program, some for the AH-1J International, and some from the AH-1Q. The Marines procured a total of 53 AH-1T improved SeaCobras to complement their existing fleet of 69 AH-1Js, entering service between October 1977 and December 1983. The AH-1T first saw combat along AH-1Js during Operation Urgent Fury, the invasion of the Caribbean island of Grenada, losing 2 aircraft and 3 crew to ground fire in the process. Bell's biggest customer for twin-engine Cobras was still Iran though, and they soon offered the Iranians a version of the AH-1T, the AH-1T+, with vastly more powerful engines. Unfortunately for Bell, the Iranian regime collapsed in 1979, eliminating them as a customer, so attention turned back towards the Marine Corps, who still considered the AH-1T to be a bit underpowered. But the Marines were looking elsewhere. USMC higher-ups knew that if they went ahead and procured the upgraded AH-1T, the chances of them being able to procure the brand new AH-64 Apache in the future would become pretty close to nil. Unfortunately for the Marines, and fortunately for Bell, they were soon told that it was already nil. Congress was not going to fund a Marine Corps version of the Apache. Yes please, I'd love a new Cobra, thanks Bell. On the 26th of June 1983, Bell began work under contract from the Marine Corps to produce 44 of the new Cobras, now known as the AH-1W SuperCobra, the first of which left the production line in March 1986. The SuperCobra was similar to the improved SeaCobra, but with these massive new engines from the AH-1T Plus program, delivering 67% more power than those in the AH-1T. Hovering at around 10,000 feet, The AH-1W could carry 3,800 pounds of payload, while the AH-1T could only carry 1,400 pounds. The increased carry capacity of the SuperCobra drastically increased its capability. It could now operate with TOW and Hellfire missiles, with strengths and weaknesses of each missile complementing each other quite nicely. It was also able to fly with AIM-9 sidewinders, AGM-122 sidearms, and even AGM-65 Mavericks. It's crazy how massive these look on a helicopter compared to a fast jet. The new aircraft could mount large drop tanks, chaff dispensers, 2.75-inch and 5-inch rockets, 20mm gun pods, thermobaric bombs and smoke grenades, as well as carrying much more capable but significantly heavier depleted uranium rounds for the 20mm rotary cannon up front. These are the fun bits, but the AH-1W came with a ridiculous catalogue of upgrades that I don't really have the time to go into. The point was that the SuperCobra was designed to operate well into the 2000s, and it did. Over the next 40 odd years of service, the AH-1W Cobras were given a slew of upgrades to sensors, navigation, radios, cockpits, etc. And in total, the USMC procured 169 new AH-1Ws and converted 43 AH-1Ts to Whiskey standard, with the last airframes being delivered in 1998. AH-1Ws would serve alongside AH-1Js and AH-1Ts as part of Desert Storm in 1991, supporting ground troops and hunting armoured targets. Marine AH-1 Cobras destroyed 97 Iraqi main battle tanks, 104 armoured vehicles, 16 bunkers and 2 AA positions, with not a single aircraft lost to enemy action. AH-1Ws also flew more than 200 sorties in Afghanistan from 2001, losing 28 TOW missiles, 42 Hellfires, 450 rockets and 93 120mm shells at enemy positions. During Operation Iraqi Freedom, the Marine Cobras were again vital. One squadron alone reported 47 T-55s, 9 T-62s, 43 T-72s, 27 APCs, 112 AA guns, 25 SAM positions, 82 artillery positions, 20 mortar positions, 156 supply vehicles, and numerous bunkers, buildings, and supply dumps. The upgrade path from AH-1G to AH-1W spanned some 30 years, but Bell and the US Marines thought there was still room for improvement. As early as 1985, Bell was experimenting with a 4-bladed rotor design, and in 1989 a new Cobra emerged, the AH-1-4BW, the 4-bladed Whiskey. This gave the 4BW 1,000 pounds greater payload, a 23 mph increase in speed, better climb rates, and superior hovering characteristics. It also allowed it to do loop-de-loops, which is of course really cool. But the 4BW wasn't quite good enough to warrant the expense, and despite being offered as the Cobra Venom or Cobra 2000 to the Marines, Great Britain and Germany, it never really got off the ground. But then, as seems to be so critical in many of my videos, the Soviet Union collapsed. Suddenly, across the board, the US Armed Forces saw their funding lower drastically. This meant no shiny new helicopters for the Marines, which meant that their current fleet of UH-1N utility helicopters and AH-1W attack helicopters were going to have to serve them well into the 2020s and most likely into the 2030s. Welcome to the H-1 upgrade program. 180 Cobras and 100 Hueys were going to be modified, becoming the AH-1Z Viper and the UH-1Y Venom. The plan was to have a high degree of commonality between the two designs, reducing training, maintenance, and spare part costs, like a rotary F-35. The Marines weren't getting a new helicopter, so they really pushed the boat out. The scale of the AH-1Z program is a testament to that. The big ticket items were the implementation of a 4-blade rotor system, along with a new transmission, and a new glass cockpit overhaul, with multifunction displays, new helmets, new sensors, the whole 9 yards. The aircraft now has twin 2-bladed tail rotors moved to the left side of the aircraft like the original Cobra. Folding main rotor blades, more fuel, new stub wings, new landing gear struts, a distinctive Hawkeye sensor dome, IR suppression, composite materials, new radars, the lot. The Viper was tested extensively during the 2000s, with this amount of upgrades naturally taking some time to get perfect. But in February 2011 it was declared operational, and in November the first units were equipped with AH-1Zs and UH-1Ys. One Viper pilot said that compared to his AH-1W, It's as if one climbs from an old VW Beetle into a brand new Mustang. It was faster, flew better, vibrated less, and the glass cockpit made it significantly easier and less tiring to fly. For example, to launch a Hellfire from an AH-1W required the gunner to flip 52 separate switches. In the Viper, this was reduced to about 3. Another plus is that the two cockpits in the Viper were almost identical, and the Marines moved the pilot to the front with the gunner in the rear, but either cockpit could essentially do either job if required. Of course, much like the F-35, the H-1 upgrade program turned out to be considerably more expensive than first thought. Originally, the upgrade would cost the taxpayers $11.5 million, but final costs were closer to $27 million per conversion and $31 million for a new aircraft. Considering a brand new Apache is only around $25 million, the Viper is not exactly the envisioned cheap option. But the Apache isn't capable of operating for extended periods at sea, so take from that what you will. Back in the Vietnam War, the Cobra was put into service as a cheap stopgap. Somehow, against all odds, the Cobra has continued to perform at extremely high levels for the best part of 50 years. And the story isn't over yet. USMC operates 189 Vipers, but it's being marketed successfully as an export product. Bahrain, the Czech Republic, Nigeria and Slovakia have all purchased their own Vipers, and the type is set to remain in service for decades to come. So much for a stopgap, eh? It's almost unbelievable that the Huey and HueyCobra are still in service. Going all the way from the Bell H-40 Iroquois to the UH-1 Venom and AH-1Z Viper is a colossal technological leap, and I hope I did both these aircraft justice in today's video. Again, this video is largely an amalgamation of 3 of my previous videos, so I can only apologise if it didn't flow quite as well as it could have. Rewriting the scripts from the beginning is some job. If you did enjoy this longer video, leave a like down below and a comment on what videos you'd like to see next. I do read all the comments, and it's a great way to get in touch. If you want a more personal or direct way to talk to me, do consider supporting me on Patreon and getting access to the exclusive Discord server, early and ad-free access to all my videos, and even some exclusive content like this video on Germany's HS-293 guided missile. And of course, thank you to all those who already support me on Patreon. Anyway guys, that's it. Subscribe to see more, and I'll catch you next time.